Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, JRB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so the regular season is almost done. You'll be watching this on Friday, and the regular season will end on Sunday, right? Where all the teams will be playing. We still have some teams, some standings that are undecided, but we do have a few events that we have to cover first before we get into that. So we'll start with a big one that happened earlier this week, after our last episode came out, and that's Michael Malone being out for the Denver Nuggets, right? And not just him, the GM as well, Calvin Booth, both guys were fired with 3 games left before the end of the season. Obviously, we had been talking about the Nuggets for a while and how they hadn't been playing as well. If you look at where they are in the standings, they are currently the 4 seed. They're 4-6 in their last 10. They did get a win, which I guess we can talk about after this a little bit. But, we talked about the issues for them all season, where the defense just has not been great. The depth hasn't really worked. And then the 3-point shooting, right, where they do have some guys that are good outside shooters, right? Gordon shot well this year. Jokic has shot well this year, but just not in enough volume. And then Jamal Murray also has been hurt recently as well. And, it just seems like since the Wolves game, things were kind of falling apart. A lot of reporting that came out after the firings that kind of suggested some stuff we had already kind of known. Like I remember when we were talking about the Nuggets in the summer, there was reporting about Michael Malone and Calvin Booth not really on the same page, and both of them kind of at each other's throats, right? Just from the perspective of, it seemed like Booth wanted him to play some of the young guys. Malone didn't trust some of the young guys and preferred the vets, right? I don't think he liked them not re-signing KCP, right? Hasn't really worked out too much for the Magic, right? But it does hurt in terms of your depth. So it's a tough situation, because with the Nuggets, you don't normally see a situation like this. We talked about it with the Grizzlies, where a guy gets fired with literally days to go before the end of the regular season. And unlike the Grizzlies, right, the Nuggets had, I think, more title aspirations going into this season. I'm sure the Grizzlies wanted to be really, really good, but, we didn't expect them to win the title, maybe get to the conference finals at best, but a different tier from the Nuggets, right? And it just seems like since the title, things have just kind of been trending downwards. The team hasn't really improved. They did have Christian Brown as a young guy who's been good, but most of the other guys have kind of just been mediocre at best. Like Jalen Pickett's played well recently, but the other guys like Hunter Tyson, and who was the other guy they drafted? Strother, right?
Yeah.
Neither of those guys have really been all that great.
Zeke Naji.
Right, Peyton Watson. Yeah, Zeke Naji. Yeah, like Watson and Brown are probably your 2 best successes. Really more so Brown than Watson, although Watson's been all right. But just as a whole, you can understand the GM thing, I guess, because that doesn't really change much this season, right? Because then you can kind of go, into the summer and pick who you want to be the next person, and then you have all that in place probably before the draft and before free agency. The coach one is a little bit more surprising, but given the reporting where it seems like guys had started to tune him out, right? The Athletic even put Russell Westbrook right in, some of the fire, right? Where it was kind of like Malone was, I guess, giving special treatment to Russ over some of the other guys on the team. Don't know how much, that plays into it, but, obviously it seems like the team had been struggling recently, and when you're not winning, right, maybe his style of coaching, his brand of coaching, because he had some, he's a guy that sometimes will make scathing remarks about the players when they don't play well, and it just kind of wears thin when, you're not winning. And if they had started to tune things out, kind of hard to really fault them. Like the Taylor Jenkins thing, it's just a little bit more surprising that it was before the playoffs. Also, David Adelman is going to take over for the Nuggets, at least for the rest of this season. We'll see about the summer, right? I know he was a guy whose name had come up in other coaching situations before. But what do you think of this, right? Because it seems like, according to the people running the Nuggets, right, more like the ownership, they're kind of hoping that this fires up the team and kind of gives them, sort of a, I guess, edge to go into the playoffs. I know after their last win against the Kings, Jokic suggested they may have woken up the beast. We'll see how that works out. But it just hasn't been great for the Nuggets this season, despite a year where Jokic has been, has basically had a career year. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I feel like it might be the new normal for the entire league. We've seen what I think three coaches fired this season. We got Mike Brown of the
Yeah.
King, all different situations, in terms of
Mhm.
where the teams were record wise and where people thought they were going to finish. But, I think similar ramifications because they're all guys who had general success. Mike Brown, Taylor Jenkins, and now Michael Malone. And it's like, well, what the heck
Mhm.
is going on? But with the Nuggets, I feel like it probably started. Well, I think we can all acknowledge that it probably started, like you said, when they weren't able to bring back some of their key guys like Bruce Brown and KCP. And, they've kind of been on the decline ever since because, we talked about it very early on when they won that title. There was a lot of discourse around that team potentially being a dynasty because nobody could really figure them out. But once they kind of lost some of their key pieces and then there were some regression injuries as well, you could just tell that things were trending very, very downhill. And I think the nail in the coffin was probably, coming off the All-Star break. They just couldn't really do much because I believe they were second, coming out of the All-Star break. But since then, they had slid down all the way to, I think, what, are they fourth now? Fifth?
Yeah, they're fourth with
Yeah,
the still a possibility to fall into the play-in if they lose out.
exactly. Yeah, they were 37 and 19, but they've been 10 and 14 since then. So it's just been god awful. The offensive and defensive efficiency numbers are in the tank pretty much. Granted, there were some injuries, like Aaron Gordon not having him on a nightly basis
Mhm.
definitely hurts you on the defensive end and kind of limits what you can do offensively as well. But there were some crushing games like the Minnesota one in double
Yeah,
OT where it just felt like things were just not
Baker.
going. Yeah, exactly. Things were just not going that well for the whole team as a whole. The blunder with Russ. It's just like I understand where people are coming from, but I think you can't really blame it on Russ because it seems like that's what they're trying to do, where it's like they're trying to make him the centerpiece for as to why there was so much tension and turmoil. I get it.
Right.
I would say he's a part of it, but not the main part. I think it was more so of a personnel thing collectively, where it goes back to the fact that you just don't have a championship roster built around, you're the best player, arguably the best player in the world. So, where you need Jokic to kind of be in a better situation than he is right now. Jamal Murray, I mean, I think there's still questions about is he going to be 100%, kind of a weird
Yes,
year for him.
I'm late.
Exactly. So kind of a weird year for him. Aaron Gordon, like there's been health concerns too, but the team has never really been that deep, and that was one of the issues even going back to the post title year, the year right after, where it's like, well, how is this team going to survive the Jokic minutes or the non-Jokic minutes, when he's not on the floor, and they didn't, and that's the thing. I think the GM firing makes a ton of sense because you didn't really bolster up the team to suit the needs for a deep playoff run like you did when you won the title. The coaching one, I don't really understand because he's a title coach, and
Mhm.
he had a lot of success. He was kind of built that, or kind of curated the culture within that team for because I think he was there for what like 10 plus years. So it is a weird situation, but like you kind of talked about, if you lose the locker room, there's really not much you can do from there. At that point, it's kind of like digging your own grave in a sense.
Right, yeah, and that's kind of the issue there. I mean, because you just factor in once they started tuning him out, I think that's just kind of where everything started to fall apart. And like you said, he'd been there for a long time, right? I think he's been there the entirety of Jokic's career. And they won a title together, right? The winningest coach in that franchise's history. But like you said, it's probably just the new normal at this point where, we've had a number of coaches, including coaches who were on other championship teams, right, that were let go, right? Because we know, for example, right, Frank Vogel for the Lakers, right? He
Great
was
point.
let go,
Yeah.
after, a couple of seasons after, when they came up short following the title, right? Not completely his
Yeah.
fault, but it was pretty clear eventually they kind of tuned him out, right? Budenholzer for the
Yeah.
Bucks,
Yeah.
right? Same thing, right? We talked about that where, eventually he got let go from the Milwaukee Bucks, right? May get let go again from the Suns, but we'll see. And then, I guess if you kind of want to look around now, you got Michael Malone, right? So you got, to factor him as well. And it just seems like a lot of these guys, regardless of, their tenure, there's only a handful of guys that probably aren't going anywhere, right? Where it's like they're only gone if they choose to be, right?
Sure.
Like Steve Kerr or Eric Spoelstra or like Popovich, like those guys aren't getting fired. Those guys are, they're only gonna be done when they say they're done,
Yeah,
right? So
multi-title guys.
right, so yeah, so that's kind of how that works. But it is interesting because when I watched them in that Kings game, it didn't really seem like it felt like they were doing anything different. I mean, it felt more so like I guess the energy was higher, and we know that there a lot of times tends to be a boost when the coach is gone and it's a kind of a new setup. I know in the first half, they built up a lead with Jokic not having to score a ton. It is the Kings, right? So how much do you take from that? I don't know, but was there anything that you saw differently? I guess maybe one difference was I guess they didn't play Westbrook quite as much, and this was a game where he wasn't, that great. But is that really the main difference? Like, because I know, maybe it's just more like because it's a different coach, he's just going to play the hot hand, and maybe that'll kind of help. But it didn't really feel like there was a ton of difference in terms of what they were doing. But maybe that might just be me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the system is going to change that much because I'm
Right.
sure. I mean, that coaches' benches are very deep in terms of the personnel that they have on their own team. Where you have offensive and defensive coordinators. So I don't think system wise much is going to change. A lot of NBA coaching really comes down to on the fly adjustments in game and also like you talked about rotations. So I think you're probably going to see Russ's minutes decline a little bit. Maybe go back to that stretch where he was kind of commanding the second unit more so than really playing almost like a starter. You know what I mean? So, and I get
Yeah.
it. With Jamal Murray being hurt, that kind of is an issue, and Russ should kind of be, I think, taking over that spot. But at the end of the day, if that's not really what the team wants or necessarily needs, then I get that completely. And I think that's kind of what they're that you're going to be seeing is like maybe different rotations and less guys playing or something like that.
Yeah, right. But it's just, but we'll see. Do you expect like, does this change your tune on their chance to make a run, or does it not really change anything at all, or what?
I mean, I think the highest or the farthest that they can go is probably the Western Conference Finals. I don't think that they could make the finals.
Mhm.
I think you do always have to kind of take the Jokic factor um, into account because of how good he is. But at the end of the day, look at that roster. It's just not the same from the title year. They got figured out. They didn't really do much to improve. And they have their bright spots. Don't get me wrong, but I think the lows and the negatives outweigh the positives in this situation. So I don't see them really making a huge run.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they could get to the finals if things go their way, but it feels like it's just going to be tougher. And again, really, honestly, comes down more to Jamal Murray
Yeah.
because again, if he hasn't played in a while, right? I don't think when was the last time we even saw him play? I mean, I want to say it was like maybe it was before that Wolves game, so he's been out for at least a week or so.
Right.
So if he can't come back, in time, and before Malone got fired, right? He kind of seemed like he didn't know when he was planning on coming back. So if he just is going to be in and out, or just we don't know until the playoffs, I don't know. I mean, I don't think they can really go that far at all because I mean, maybe they could win a first round matchup maybe without him, but certainly they can't make a deep run without him. It's just the West is, so deep and they're not significantly better than, any of the teams in the Western Conference if they even are at all.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough situation for them to be in, but at the end of the day, I don't think a coaching change really would have, you know, changed a whole lot for this team. It's all really contingent, I think, on the personnel that you have.
Yeah, and then they got two regular season games left to go, one against the Grizzlies and then another one against Houston. That's their last game of the season. I don't, we'll see if Houston plays their guys, but their seeding is still in the balance, right? So if they lose both of those games, they could fall into the play-in. If they if they win both of those games, maybe there's still a chance at the 2 seed possible, or no, not 2, the 3 seed maybe, because nobody's really clinched anything outside of OKC. Houston is pretty close at this point. I know they've lost a couple of games, but the amount of distance between them and the other teams is a little bit much for,
Yes.
them. They would probably just need to win one to mathematically clinch it, but they
Yes, sir.
probably got it
Yeah.
at this point.
Yep.
Yeah. And from a Rockets perspective, just as a whole, shout out to them just for the way that they've been, balling, especially the latter part of the season, right? Getting wins, over teams like OKC and Golden State, and everything else, right? They've been, I think, significantly better than, what we expected, even though we thought they'd be better. It'll be funny when we go back over our over unders, kind of go over, our picks because we did hit on some, but,
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah. Shout out to
Um,
Houston, like you said.
yeah, we also had a big game the other night right before we got on, and it was between the Lakers and the Mavs. It was Luka's return to Dallas, right? It was kind of a weird game, right, where we knew what was going to happen going in, right, where there was going to be some tension, there was going to be some drama. They had the tribute video, right, and it was a pretty back and forth game, kind of like the last one, because people might have forgotten, but both of these teams had already played before. It was just in LA, and that was kind of a back and forth game. I think that one was with Kyrie and not AD. Right, this time AD was back, and not Kyrie. And predictably, we expected the Mavs were going to lose the game. They put up a fight. It looked like they had a chance, but as we talked about, especially since the Kyrie injury, just not quite enough on the offensive end terms of creation to really be able to take advantage of, some strengths that they do have in terms of their size, their athleticism and defense. And they also just didn't have an answer for Luka, right? He had 45, 8 and 6, 7 of 10 from 3, 16 of 28. So you pretty much kind of expected him to go in. Again, shout out to him for, being really emotional before the game. Looked like he was in tears and then pretty much put that aside. And then kind of just went out and did his thing. But it's just kind of funny because you look at that Mavs team and you look at the players on the roster and you're like, wow, what if they didn't make the trade? What if Luka was healthy and came back? This team we really liked and we thought they had a real shot at maybe being able to make the NBA Finals. Even if Kyrie was healthy, they'd still be in the mix. They'd be a contender. But just as a whole, you just watch it and you just kind of still think to yourself, why did they do this? Because you had a championship contending, roster in place, right? I mean, again, none of these players are bad, but you just kind of envision how this would look with a guy like Luka in place and a potentially healthy Kyrie Irving. But, you're not going to get that, and you're never getting that now, right? Because Luka's a Laker, and then you're not going to see Kyrie for the rest of this season. May not even see him for most of next year, right? And it's, kind of just AD and a bunch of guys out there, and without, a real legit creating guard to set him up, right? It's going to be hard on some nights for him to have the impact, especially with the way the Lakers were defending him, right? Where they were constantly doubling him and dropping him and kind of forcing him to either give up the ball or just not really be too much involved in the offense. You give credit to some of the other guys. And again, they tried to give him as much as they could handle because of the size and the athleticism, but just not really enough for them. But a very strange game, which you expected, right? And just also the crowd, right, where no boos at all for Luka, right? Fire Nico chants. It felt more like a Laker home game than a Mavs home game. And, just a rough situation, too, for the Mavs players, right? Because they're at home. They don't have anything to do with this, right? And they're pretty much kind of just kind of in, the fire, right? If you know what I mean, right? It's just a rough situation for, pretty much everybody involved. And it's only made worse with the injury. And now you just kind of wonder, does this Dallas team have any chance to really do anything for the foreseeable future? Because that's probably the only way that this issue between the fans and the organization will go away, if it even does.
Yeah, I mean, overall, it's just crazy. I mean, I don't know how you mess up I would even go as far to say as like, the bloodline lineage kind of thing that they were doing, the passing of the torch between Dirk and Luca, and you just completely messed it up pretty much with one phone call, and now he's gone, and I really feel for the fans like a lot because they've had they've had some up years and some really down years, and I don't really know, like you said, if there's going to be any repairing this stuff because I think the future was so bright. And now all that has really just been overshadowed. I mean, and I think they'll be somewhat of a playoff team, but nowhere near to the point of a year in year out contender because you just don't have anybody on the roster that's Luka Doncic level. And I get it. Defensively, the team has an identity. It's a strong identity for sure. I think nobody's going to argue against that. But like you talked about, Kyrie not being on the floor, But even then, Kyrie's not really a table setter. We already know he's a scorer and one of the most gifted players of all time, but he's not a guy who night in, night out gets every single player involved. And I think that's what this team is really missing, because like you talked about, AD needs that guy to really, set him up for success. He can do stuff on his own, but it's just not going to look as good. And you could tell. Look at the lineup. Look at the roster. Like I said, defensive upside, you love it, but offensively, I don't really know what this team is really going to look like in the near future, especially considering the ages of some of these guys on the roster. Like I think they have some great young pieces, and it would have looked really good considering the fact that you had Luka Doncic and
Mm-hmm.
you had all this great defensive personnel. You had the shooter like Klay Thompson. I feel for him too. He's in the situation as well. He quite literally went to this team to be set up by Luka Doncic on a night in, night out basis, and now there's nobody giving him any good shots. So, you're stuck with
Yeah.
Spencer Dinwiddie practically running the offense, and that you can see how that goes. But, I don't know what Dallas goes from here or where they go from here. And yeah, I don't even know how Nico Harrison still has a job, if you want me to be honest.
Yeah, we'll see how that Dallas situation unfolds, but yeah, it's really tough, to be in that situation. So, we'll see where they go from here, but yeah. And then just from a Laker perspective for Luka, he does look. I think the difference with him now compared to what we saw when he was initially a Laker is he's looking more comfortable attacking bigs off the bounce, because I think that was kind of a problem for him earlier, right? Where you can where you could see like him kind of just settling a lot more. But in this game, even though he was shooting some step back threes, he was able to kind of beat some guys off the dribble, including bigs that do have some level of mobility. And you're gonna need that, from him if you want to really be able to make a run if you're the Lakers, right? Because offensively, right, that's what, that's going to be their strength in terms of those guys being able to score and pass, but they're also going to have to be able to beat guys off the dribble, because we've seen them have some issues with some of these switching defenses where guys can kind of take them out of some of these possessions, and maybe they turn the ball over and they don't really create some good shots. But at least for him, it seems like that's a good sign going forward, because again, you're going to need that. And their ability to, be able to handle some of these teams with a little bit more size with those small ball lineups, because even some of the previous teams they played against, like the Thunder, the Rockets, and others, those are big teams.
Yeah, for sure. Like even in this game, Jackson Hayes didn't play a whole lot. He only played 14 minutes. Like look at the minutes
Right.
distribution. Like, and I think Braun has even talked about it. Like that lineup where it's like Braun, Luka, AR in the wings, like whether it be like Hachimura or Finney Smith or Vanderbilt. Yeah, that lineup is really cool because they're so switchable and versatile. They're big and fat, or well, small and fast, but in terms of like small in height, but big in length and weight and stuff like that. So
Right.
very deceiving, I think, if you're the other team where it's like you look at LeBron, he might be at center or Rui might be at center, and then all of a sudden you found yourself doubled and blitzed and you can't go anywhere. So I think I do like a lot of what LA has done defensively and offensively, because we've already been talking about it for the past few weeks. That trio of AR, Braun, and Luka is just phenomenal because of what they're able to do.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, that's going to be a big thing, for them going forward. Is what do those small ball teams? What do they look like against some of those type of teams? Because, like you said, it's a smaller, quote unquote, in height, but then when you look at it, it is a bunch of guys like 6'7",
Yeah.
6'8", 6'9", and big and physical, right?
Yep.
So you usually see like with smaller teams, like say like a team like Golden State, they do have physical guys, but they don't have like a ton of just big guys, right?
Sure.
But they're very fast, very quick and speedy, and that's kind of they're like the original small ball team, right?
Yes.
But for a team like the Lakers, we haven't really seen something like that. But again, it's also out of necessity because you don't have a lot of just centers that you can put out there, right? It's basically just Jackson Hayes, right? Because the other two centers, what are they? Jemison and Koloko, they're two-way guys, so they're not even part of the actual roster. And then the guy who is a part of the actual roster, Alex Len, you just can't really play him,
No.
right?
No.
Just
Can't.
he got an opportunity when he first got there, but it just didn't really work, right? He didn't really mesh with the big and physical and fat. He's just too slow,
Yeah.
right? He can't really do much, but that's just kind of how it goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see what they are able to do. But with that, they have clinched a spot in the playoffs, so they have avoided the play-in. Their spot in the playoffs isn't set just yet. They need to win one of these remaining two games either against the Rockets or the season finale against the Blazers. So we may not know until the next time we record,
Yes, sir.
what seed they may be in.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Um, and now I guess we can kind of start getting into our All NBA and our season awards. I guess which one do you want to start off with? Would you prefer to start with like the All NBA ones, or would you prefer to kind of start with the other awards?
Um, let's start off with the other awards. Let's go off with a
All right,
bang.
so like MVP. All right,
Uh
so
huh.
guess we'll do MVP. If you want to start there, mine is SGA. I mean, I think that one at this point, it's kind of hard to see him, to see someone else winning it. Obviously, Jokic just had a fantastic season, and I don't think anybody should be mad if somebody feels that he should be. But I just think the fact that they're so far ahead of everyone else in the West, and I mean, they have the best record in the league. He's a big part of that. He's been great, right? 33 a game, 5 rebounds, 6 assists, 52 from the field, 38 from three, right? Effective field goal percentage, 57%, right there. He's a big part of the best defensive team in the league. And they're still a really good offensive team, but they are a defense first team. Career year basically on the best team in the league by a decent amount. I mean, obviously the Cavs and the Celtics are right there, but with Jokic, again, he's had a great season. It just feels like this latter part, like the Thunder have been turning it up and they've been winning. I know they had a couple of bad losses against the Rockets in LA, but just as a whole, while Jokic's stats have still been, and it's not really even his fault. It's just, again, I think SGA has been so impressive and his team has been so impressive as well. And he's such a big part of that. I just can't really imagine. I don't think anybody else is winning it at this point. I think he's the prohibitive favorite. I'm not going to go so far as to say as he's going to win it unanimously. I think Jokic will at least get some votes. It's probably just those two at this point. But I think this is SGA's. I think he's going to win it this year, and that's the guy that I have.
Yeah, me too. That's also my guy for MVP. Kind of, similar reasons for you, but I do kind of want to shout out Jokic because I think, when you have
Mm-hmm.
this much discourse amongst NBA fans where, it's pretty much 50-50 amongst all the fans, that means it's a great race. I don't think we should be putting any players down like a lot of people are online, talking about, Shea and his free throws or Jokic and his defense or whatever, or lack thereof. So it's like, shout out to both of these guys, but I think Shea has the slight edge due to the record. I think, the advanced analytics are very interesting as well. A lot of them tip in Shea's favor. One of the highest net ratings in NBA history, by the way. Just keep that in mind. So, it goes deeper than just, points, assists, rebounds, and free throws. You know what I mean? So, me personally, I do take record into account because I think the most valuable player of the league generally tends to be the best player on the best team.
Yeah, I'd say this one is I think he's got a great case here. Again, like I said, I can see people picking Jokic, but I
Mm-hmm.
think SGA is going to win it. And I think that's the pick. It'd be one thing if they were like really close, like if they were like a couple wins apart.
Yep.
But with OKC being so far out, I just feel like it's pretty tough to, make the case otherwise. And it's going to work. Like I just think SGA is going to win it at this point.
Agreed.
Yeah. Um. Do we want to go with Rookie of the Year? I guess.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So I got Stephon Castle. So I think this was not our picks. Or I know it wasn't mine, right? But going in, I think we had the same picks.
Yeah, I think we had Zach Edey. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Going into the year, but we both liked Castle a lot. And over the course of the season, if you watch the Spurs play, watch them the other night against Golden State, right? Where the Spurs beat the Warriors right at the end with the Barnes triple, right? Just the way he's been able to play on both ends of the floor, right? Obviously, can't really shoot the three, right? Not even really a great free throw shooter for a guard, but just his energy, his ability to defend, pretty good rebounder and playmaker too, right? Because that was kind of a question we had coming in. Was he going to be? I mean, he's not. I mean, especially now with all those other guys out. I know Chris Paul's out there, but they give him a lot of minutes where he's kind of running their offense, and he's again doing about as well of a job as you could ask for given how shorthanded they've been. And he's been great the last 10 games or so. I mean, basically 26-6 for a team that doesn't have a whole lot to play for. And in a rookie class that is kind of historically underwhelming, right? Given the talent in there, right? I think he's still been really good. And I think he's a guy that you can see why they did not want to give him up in a trade for De'Aaron Fox, because I think he's a very versatile, useful player on both ends of the floor. Still has to be able to get a jump shot going, but that's kind of, that's the big thing, right? And that's kind of what we've seen from some of these young guys, where if they can get a consistent jumper, then look out. That guy's probably going to be an all-star. So I think it's been a great rookie season for him. And again, this was a guy that I think most people by and large liked a lot. Most people didn't have him as the number one pick, but he's been a fantastic rookie this year for the Spurs. And if he stays there, long term, right, I think that's a great additional piece around these guys.
Yeah, he's been amazing. He's my pick as well. I think there are some other guys who could have gotten it, but their play kind of was a little bit too up and down. I think Stephon Castles was probably the most consistent across both ends of the floor. That two-way potential is for sure there. I think we already know that he's almost a pure lockdown defender, but offensively is where we really want to see him grow. But on the season, 14 and a half points is pretty good, in terms of that. You'd probably like to see the efficiency go up a little bit, but it's his rookie year. Nobody expected him to be, the top rookie in the class. So, you do want to shout him out for that. And offensively, I think he's raw, but there's so much untapped potential there, to be able to, be a scorer, use your body, get to the lane, and also open things up for Wemby as well. And yeah, like you said, the number one key is going to be developing that jump shot long term. But for now, rookie of the year for me.
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly. And again, this was a guy that we both liked going into the draft, and it's good to see that, he's been, kind of as good, if not even better than advertised.
Yes.
Yeah. Defensive player of the year. This one I think is probably one that I think might go down to the wire, right? We know some guys have tried to make some cases late. I actually have Evan Mobley for this one. And for me, I think it's just when you look at the Cavs and you look at what they've been able to do all year. Of course, I know they're not the number one defensive team, but, defensive rating, they're still top 10. He's the biggest reason for why they are that, right? You can see when he's either not playing or not out on the floor, it just looks like a different team. And I think also just over the course of the entire season, I think that the consistency is kind of what I'm looking at. I know there are other guys that have probably just been better as a whole late, right? But I think just over the course of the whole year, I kind of prefer that as opposed to kind of just, rewarding the last, few months or whatever, right? And I think for the Cavs, other than, a couple of weird stretches, they've consistently been one of the three best teams in the NBA over the course of the entire season. And I think Mobley's been, his jump on both ends of the floor, I think, has been a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to shout out Draymond Green for sure, because he is a very crucial anchor to the Warriors defense. But I think Evan Mobley's impact is a little bit further widespread, and that's my pick as well. You can clearly tell night in, night out, he can play so many different roles. He can be a guy that chases guys off the 3-point line and baits them into, Jared Allen or even himself, to get like a sweet chase down block. He can be a roamer. He can be that anchor. So, very switchable guy. Not going to talk about what he does offensively. No need to, because this is a defensive player of the year conversation. But, the jump that I've seen has been phenomenal. Almost 2 blocks a game. Obviously, I think Wemby probably would have been the guy to take it home if not for the season-ending injury. But I think Evan Mobley is just as good of a pick for this award, just on the fact that he does things night in, night out, that are pretty much not really, you can't really replicate it.
Yeah, and I guess the question is like which teams have a lot of other high level defense, like OKC. Of course, you can make the case for multiple of those, any of those guys to be defensive player of the year, but they have so many really high level defenders, and not that Cleveland doesn't, right? You just you look at the personnel, and you don't really look at Cleveland. You wouldn't think that they'd be in a top 10 defensive team.
Yep.
But they are, right? And I think that's a big part of it.
Yep, because of one guy, pretty much.
Yeah, coach of the year. This one I'm gonna go with Kenny Atkinson, right? Just to kind of go with the Cavs thing, where their record, now it's not the best in the NBA anymore, right? But just the fact that you look at their record this season. I believe because they just lost right to the Indiana Pacers, right? I want to say now they're 63-17, which is still really good. Good for second in the NBA. And just him coming in and taking what was already a really good team, right? But making them even better, making them look more, just looking better on both ends of the floor, especially offensively, because that was the problem for the Cavs last year. Defensively, they were good, but their offense was kind of up and down. They had a lot of injuries too, but it just feels like he's just added a little bit more stability. The guys, I guess, like him, more so than they did Bickerstaff last year. Although Bickerstaff's done a great job, and he can be an honorable mention guy as well. Ime Udoka, I think, can be an honorable mention guy as well. And if somebody picked either of those guys, wouldn't be mad at that one either, right? But just with the way that he's been able to kind of turn this team into what feels like a legitimate championship team, whereas before they just seemed like a good team, like a really good team. And now they've taken that next step, and I think he's been a big part of that. It's not been just him, but I think he's done more than enough to earn this award.
Yeah, easily the hardest, I think, award to kind of gauge because you can look at it from so many different lenses. Like you said, shout out to JB Bickerstaff, with the Pistons having a great turnaround of a franchise within practically 1 year of being there. Shout out to Kenny Atkinson as well. That is not my pick. I know I'm zagging here, but my pick is Mark Daigneault
Okay.
from the Thunder. I think, being the number one seed or number one overall seed is an accomplishment in its own. They have the NBA best net rating along with a franchise best 66 wins. So that's kind of enough for me. And I know I believe he won it last year if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, he won it last year. The Celtics had the best record last year, but
Right.
he did win it last
Right.
year.
So he might probably not win it back to back. Really just zagging just because I think, that's just my personal belief and opinion. But, I wouldn't be opposed to Kenny Atkinson winning it either or Bickerstaff. So I'm pretty much down with whatever here.
Yeah, and Coach of the Year has kind of been interesting where it's not always just automatically given to the team with the best record.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like last year was Dagnall.
Yep.
Before that, it was Mike Brown.
Mm-hmm.
But then the year Monty Williams won it, they did have the best record because they won 64 games,
Sure.
right? I think Budenholzer when he won it for the Bucks, I think they had the best record.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, when Kerr won it, they had the best record of all time. So it depends, obviously, but yeah, I wouldn't really be mad at that one. Like you said, that one I think you have multiple choices, and I don't think you can really go wrong with any of them. Because, like you said, I mentioned Atkinson, you mentioned Dagnall, but I think some of the other guys like a Bickerstaff or Ime Udoka, any of those guys would be, or even like a Reddick if you wanted to throw him in there,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well. Or yeah, like I mean, all of those guys, I think you could make a really strong case for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so six man of the year. This one might actually be a zag too. I'm gonna go with Malik Beasley
Oh
for
wow.
the
Wow. Yeah. It is.
yeah, for the Detroit Pistons. It's kind of funny, right? Because this was a guy, right, who was on the Wolves, right? He was on the Nuggets. He was on that Lakers roster that went to the conference finals. Didn't play a whole lot. Then he was on the Bucks last year and was the starter. And then they just didn't bring him back. And he went to the Pistons, and he's actually been like a big part of them being really good this year. You look at his stats he's given them, 16 a game, mostly off the bench, 41% from three, right? One of the league leaders in three-pointers made this season, right? I mean, he's had just an incredible year shooting the basketball. And they need him in a lot of these games, right? Because, he's a big part of their offensive attack, right? Because last year they had little to no three-point shooting whatsoever. And now, he comes in off the bench and kind of gives them a different look. And he's had a number of big games where, he's kind of saved their bacon in some of these, right? So, obviously, because most of his shots attempts are from three, he can go hot and cold. But this has been, I think, probably his best season in a while. And, I mean, for the Bucks, he was good for most of last season. But I think this year he's been really good. Obviously not starting, but still playing 28 minutes a game. And a couple, of course, there's always, the usual suspects, right? Guys like, I guess, Peyton Pritchard, or you could even put like a Nas Reed. Malik Monk has been a starter at different points. So, then some of these guys, some of the awards, it's a little bit tough because, they're not going to be eligible for some of them, as we'll get into all NBA. But just as a whole, this one, I'm going to go with this one.
Yeah, I think it's a great pick for sure. I'm going with Peyton Pritchard, a little bit more on the obvious kind of side of things.
Mhm.
Averaging 13 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists, almost a steal a game in 28 minutes. Not really a whole lot that needs to be said. Similar production to last year. 40% from three, by the way. So, still putting up a lot of threes and making them at a high efficiency. The Boston Celtics, we already know that they're poised to potentially go back to back. So, I think a crucial part of their team is definitely, their sneaky depth where, they do have a lot of guys that come in off the bench and really feel like they would be starters on other teams. So shout out to Peyton Pritchard. I think, he's probably going to end up taking this award home.
Mhm. Yeah. And then for most improved, don't know if this is a Zag or not, but I'm going to go with Dyson Daniels for the Atlanta Hawks, right? I know there's some other choices that people have, some guys like Cade Cunningham. I think I've heard Austin Reeves at different point. Of course, you can mention any other guys, but I think for Dyson Daniels, just look at what he was doing last season, right? Where, last season he was basically a guy that sometimes played, sometimes didn't. So really was not a big part of the New Orleans Pelicans rotation. And when he was traded in that DeJounte Murray trade, he was almost kind of discussed like a throw-in, essentially, right? Like, not a guy that was just, a nobody, but, the highlight was DeJounte Murray, right? Dyson Daniels, you kind of just blinked and you're like, oh, he's been traded to Atlanta. We'll see what he does. But he's been legit really, really awesome this year. I think you look at him, 14 points a game, 6 rebounds, 4 assists, right? So more of what he was already doing well. 3 steals a game, right? Leading the league in steals, which is ridiculous, right? Earning him that new nickname, Great Barrier Thief. The 3-point shooting now has kind of come along, right? I think it's dropped off a little bit recently, but he's still, I think, right now just under 35% from three, right? And, again, being a better 3-point shooter, in addition to all the other good aspects of his game, his rebounding, playmaking, and obviously defense, right? He's become a legitimate, really good player for the Hawks now. And, now you don't feel anywhere near as bad, about the Hawks in the future potentially because, he's now a young guy that's going to come in. He's going to get paid. And he's a big part of that new identity that they developed before Jalen Johnson got hurt, where it's Trae Young and a bunch of long, athletic guys who can get it done on both ends of the floor, especially defensively. And, I think you got to give a lot of credit to him, right? Because he was a guy that I think a lot of people liked in the draft, but we didn't really know what we were going to get out of him. But now you see him in a situation like Atlanta, where now playing regular minutes, starters minutes, and getting a ton of opportunities, and he's taking advantage of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I never sold the stock on him.
Right.
As I was a
Mhm.
very big advocate on him being one of the better players of that draft class. But I'm gonna zag even more severely.
Mhm.
I'm going Amen Thompson here. I know that might be a very very polarizing take, but if you look at his numbers last year, he only averaged 9 points on 53% from the field, 13% from the 3 point line in 22 minutes. So very interesting rookie year. I think he showed a lot of, potential, a lot of flashes. But then this year, you really saw kind of a lot of things coming together, except for really the 3 point shot, even though it did go up, to about 27%. On very limited attempts. But this year he's averaging 14 points on 55% from the field. But defensively, he seems to have somehow gotten better than last year. Offensively, I think, you love what you see in terms of his ability to be a niche player, but also kind of take over a game at points. There's times where he's been able to just crash the O boards along with Shengun, and they kind of just overwhelm other teams. With paint mashing, because he's not really a threat from the outside. But then defensively, he's able to guard the best player night in, night out, and he's a huge reason as to why Houston has seen a lot of success, especially late in the season. So that's my pick. I know that might be kind of very under the radar, but that's my guy.
No, I think that's a good one. Just because, again, and he's another guy that I think we all, liked, and we all kind of wondered, what could the best version of him be? And I don't think this is going to be the best version of him, but we're already kind of getting an idea of he's going to be, a really awesome, super versatile player.
Yes, sir.
And as long as the offense continues to grow, right, that guy's going to be headed for, perennial all star, potentially plus. I mean, he's already been. I mean, just watch him, in the last couple of games he played, right? Go back and watch, what he did against Golden State and how he was able to hold Steph to just 3 points, right? And I know, some of it's them being physical, maybe being able to get away with stuff, but just as a whole, what he's been able to do, on that end particularly. And we knew he'd be a strong defender. And now you can kind of see him developing some of that offensive game, as well. And, like you
Playmaking.
said, yeah, yeah, and playmaking as well. Because he was initially kind of drafted, we were kind of looking at him as like a point guard,
That's what I
but
thought he
now he's
was.
kind of like a do it all hybrid player where,
Yeah.
yeah, now he's kind of playing a lot of four, while also still having that playmaking downhill ability. So there's a lot to like
Yeah.
about his game. So I think, pretty much, there's a lot, like I think there's a ton of room to continue to grow. And as long as, that offensive game continues to go up, the sky's probably the limit for him.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So now, I guess now we get into all NBA, right? Because again, we only have a couple of days of the regular season to go. So I guess we'll start with the usual first, second, third all NBA. We'll start with first. I'd say probably 4 out of the 5 for most people is going to be pretty consistent, right? So I Tatum, Jokic, SGA, Giannis, and then after that I have Mitchell right to round out the first team All
Yes.
NBA. Again, I know his stats may not look quite as good as maybe some other guys, but I think he's been a big part of what they do in terms of how they're able to win. I know he's taken a step back in terms of not just kind of being just a ball dominant scorer, but I think you still have to give him credit for being able to do all that. And his stats are still really good. His minutes are down. So I think comparable to a lot of other guys, he's been, this has been, one of the most enjoyable years, especially if you already like Donovan Mitchell.
Yeah, it's the same exact for me as well. Pretty much copy and paste from you, but yeah, same logic with Donovan Mitchell. I think on a team that has so much talent, and he's not really stepping on anybody's toes or making anybody feel uncomfortable, especially like really specifically Darius Garland. I think those two being able to coexist and he's still putting up the numbers that he's putting up, I think is amazing, and I think he deserves to be on this All NBA list because he is the I guess the best player on the East's best team.
Yeah. And with the other guys, it's kind of just how good they've been, all year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I mean, you look at Tatum, I mean, all these guys, Tatum, Jokic, SGA, Giannis, all those guys have basically been, top 5 players, and in the case of obviously SGA and Tatum, their teams have been awesome. Jokic and Giannis, their records are probably better than what their actual team, is, and they've been, great in the games that they've played. So I think, again, I think for first team All NBA, that one's probably pretty set in terms.
Yeah.
I think most people have an idea of how it's going to go. The thing that's kind of tough about this year's All NBA is that there's a bunch of guys that won't end up making the cut that probably would be on these lists because they've missed too many games, right? Because obviously, no Embiid, right? That ship sailed a while ago. Obviously, no Luka. He's missed too much time. No Wemby. I don't think Durant at this point, right? Because I think he's missed too many games, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't think he can be on there, as well. So there's a lot. Brunson cut it close, right? But I think he's gonna make the. I think he's gonna make the cut, right? I believe it's 65 games, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say, at this point, it's tough because there's some guys that I think would be some obvious picks, and there's some guys where you say, oh, well, they mainly got in because other guys were hurt, but those guys still played really well. So I think you kind of have to look at it, from that perspective. I guess we'll, then we'll go to second team All NBA.
Yeah.
I feel like this is probably where it's going to be a little bit different, I'd say, for, some people. So I had Edwards, I had Towns, I had Mobley, and then I had LeBron and Steph on the second All NBA team. And I think, when you look at all those guys, for some of them, case is pretty cut and dry. Towns, by and large, I think he had a stretch where he was hurt. But by and large, he's been great pretty much the entire season for the Knicks. Big part of what's been able to keep them afloat, even while Brunson's been out. Mobley, we already talked about him, with his defense, right? Edwards, obviously the record is what it is, or their standing situation is what it is. But he's been the least of their problems. He's had a great season in terms of expanding his offensive game, not just the playmaking, but his ability to shoot as well, right? He came into the league and we were kind of wondering, is this guy going to be able to, knock down jumpers at a consistent rate? And he's been one of the best 3-point shooters in the league and on high volume now, right? Like 40% basically on 10 attempts a game, right? right? With Mobley, his expanded game offensively too, right? That's it's kind of hard to be on All NBA if you're not a guy who can play on both ends of the floor, right? That's why a guy like Gobert, for as good as he can be on defense, he's not generally been much of an offensive guy, right? So he's usually kind of quote unquote relegated to all defense, but just as a whole. I think, and then for LeBron and Steph, right, the case for them, right? Obviously, they've had their moments where they haven't looked as good, but as a whole, right, LeBron has been consistently better and better as the season's gone on. He did get hurt with the groin injury, right? So, because I know there was kind of a push at one point to maybe go beyond second team All NBA, but pretty much capped, I would say, at second. And he's been great for them, and a big. I know that people talk about the plus minus, the on and off ratings. But if you watch that team, you know that they're not a better team when he's not out there, right? I know there's kind of been some funkiness with the lineups, and then for Steph, obviously he's been great. This is kind of one of those scenarios where it's like, yeah, it's probably been more so because how he has played as of late, but he's been just so good that it's kind of hard to leave him off there. Of course, you could knock him down to second if you want, or third if you want. That's perfectly fine. But again, now the Warriors have shot up to one of the better teams. Although, unfortunately, with that loss to the Spurs, right now they're possibly in the play-in, but they'll probably finish a little ahead of it, depending on what happens at the end of the season.
Yeah. This is funny. My list is almost identical to yours, but I did put Steph in third team,
Okay.
and I put Cade in second team.
Okay.
I know that might be a little bit ambitious, maybe. I don't know how people feel about
Not
it,
at all.
but I think the season that he's had has been phenomenal. He's just the seventh player ever to average at least 25 points, 9 assists, and 6 rebounds. So already an elite company. The sky's the limit. Showing us why he was picked number one. Detroit has had a great turnaround season, and granted, it does start with coaching, but it starts with your best player. And when your best player, has veterans around him that know what they're doing, that know how to put the ball in the hoop, and you have a guy like Cade Cunningham who can literally set people up for success while also creating his own pace, and really, changing the game whenever he wants to on the offensive end. I think he deserves this spot, and yeah, that's all I really have to say about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of, like you said, the numbers combined with the impact, right, and the winning. And like you said, this is a guy where he was a guy that some people had started selling their stock on, right? I
Oh,
mean, I'm
I
glad I
was
didn't
selling.
sell my stock, but um,
I
but
was
he is a
close,
guy, right?
man.
Yeah, exactly. And but now we see with the talent that they've been able to put around him and the growth of everybody, including him, right? Now you can kind of see that he's a legit star level guy, right? I mean, and you look at the way Detroit's been playing for, the better part of the last 50 games or so, they've essentially been a top 10 team, right, in the league net rating wise. And he's been, a big part of that. I know he's missed a couple of, missed some stretches recently due to injury. But yeah, I mean, again, his numbers are incredible, right? 26, 9, and 7. With the 3-point shot, being league average now. So that's great. So just nothing but positives, I would say, for him.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Now, you go into third team All NBA, right? I have Cade Cunningham on here, right? Again, I mean, he could easily be second, and it wouldn't be shocking, nor would it be a problem,
Mhm.
at all. Brunson, Triple J, also Halliburton to round it out. And I was really, really like trying to decide whether or not I wanted Darius Garland or J Dub on the
Oh,
list.
okay.
But I went with Garland just because I think he's been. I think when you look at the change in terms of like with Mitchell, right, a big part of it is now Garland's got more opportunities to kind of control the offense as well. Those I think those guys have been two of the three best players on that team. I mean, it's tough because it's like you got three All NBA guys on there, but they all have been that great. And then Brunson, he probably would have been second had he not gotten hurt. I think that's really the only reason why he fell because he basically had an unfortunate stretch where he had 2 weeks where he missed time due to injury, and that kind of allowed some of these other guys who, to their credit, have played great, but it kind of gave them the opportunity to kind of slide ahead of him. And then Jaren Jackson Jr., he's just been their best player this year for the Grizzlies, which again is great for him, not so much for the team, but it's been great for him individually. And then Halliburton as well. If you've looked at how he's been playing for a while, right? Since he kind of he had that early rough stretch in the season, but pretty much since December or so, he's been fantastic, and I think he has played his way back into kind of like Steph. And it wasn't like either of those guys were horrible. They were just a little bit underwhelming relative to what we had seen of them. But in the case of Halliburton, right, pretty much like for the last several months, he's been pretty much 20, 10 plus guy, 50, 40, from the field, which is, again, which is great. And, for the Pacers, they've been also winning, right? I mean, I think right before we got on, right, there was a game between them and the shorthanded Cavs. The Pacers ended up winning that game. So I believe they pretty much are right there I think they've clinched the 4 seed, if I'm not mistaken, or at the very least, they've gotten a top 4 seed, right? I guess mathematically, I think because the Knicks lost, technically they could catch them. I think the Knicks have the tiebreaker, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, we'll see. But either way, that's my all NBA teams.
Yeah, mine is somewhat similar. I think there are two differences. So I have Brunson, obviously, similar reasons as you stated. Steph, Halliburton, Triple J, and then at the 5, Şengün. I
Okay.
think you have to put one of the Rockets guys there. I'm not comfortable enough at all to put Jalen Green there, but I think with Şengün, he leads their team in rebounding. Look at the record, very similar, production to Sabonis, and people consider Sabonis to be one of the most underrated players in the league. So why not have Şengün here as well? And yeah, like I said, they're the number 2 seed, so I think they just have to have somebody there as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I mean, again, you look at the numbers. I mean, he's basically been the best player for the 2 seed in the Western Conference,
Yeah,
right? I mean, again, basically just under 20 and 10 a game, or over 10 rebounds, but just under 20 a game with 5 assists. And again, basically been their best player for the vast majority of the season.
yes,
So,
sir.
now I guess we move on to the all defensive teams. So I'll start with first team all NBA defense. Again, I don't feel like these lists will probably be drastically different. But maybe I'm sure maybe there might be a difference in placement. But for my first team, obviously Mobley, because I have him as defensive player of the year, so that's kind of an obvious one. Then I had Triple J, I had Draymond, I had Dyson Daniels, and then I also had Amen Thompson.
All right. Well, I mean, I agree. That's a great list. I had Dyson
Mhm.
Daniels, Evan Mobley, Triple J, Amon Thompson, and I had to put Lou Dort.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I mean, and again, like all these guys are great defensively.
yes,
For some of them, I guess you kind of have to factor in, like, for me, I had what, like 3, 4 guys that basically play the 4 or 5,
right.
defensively, and part of that's just because of the responsibility, they have, right? But just as a whole, I mean, again, and all these guys, look at the numbers, look at their team's defense when they're out there. Obviously, for some of them, like they're not on, like say Dyson Daniels, the Hawks are not like a great team, so some of the stats are going to look kind of weird. For Jaren Jackson Jr., Memphis's defense has been very bad, right, for a while now. Even when he's out there, so that's kind of unfortunate. But I don't think it's because of those guys. You know what I mean, right? Like just for the Hawks, part of it's injury. But and then just as a whole for the Grizzlies, it's just kind of is what it is. And then for
Yes, sir.
second team All NBA, Lou Dort's there. Then I also have J Dub, also from the Oklahoma City Thunder. I have Tamani Kamara of the Portland Trailblazers. I actually think his defensive growth, and just the other defensive guys as a whole, Denny Avdia, Klingon, and others, right? Like Portland's actually been a pretty solid defensive team during this second half of the season, where they've kind of gone under the radar, right? Because nobody's really watching them because they're not a great team. If you catch them on the right night, they can look really good. And a lot of it's been with their defense. So I think he's got a lot to do with that.
Agree.
Former Phoenix Suns draft pick that could have been very helpful for them, but he's not there right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, just to finish it off, still have Rudy Gobert, because the Wolves have still been a really good defensive team, and I think he's been a big part of that. Of course, you could put maybe a couple of other guys if you want. And then I rounded it out with Ivica Zubac, because I think with the Clippers, they've been a terrific defensive team as well, pretty much all year, even when Kawhi wasn't playing. And he's the guy in the middle that's kind of been locking all of it down. So, that's my second team All NBA defense list.
All right. Mine pretty similar once again. But I had Tamani Kamara, J Dub, OG Anunoby, Draymond Green, and Rudy Gobert. I think the the difference with OG Anunoby is it's kind of similar to, I guess, the J Dub situation where he's very switchable.
Mhm.
Pretty much can guard 1 through 5, just like J Dub. So he's very crucial because I think without him, the Knicks would be absolutely cooked on the defensive end. Mikal Bridges is pretty good, but I don't know. I feel like OG Anunoby brings a lot more to the table than him, and yeah, he's practically keeping them alive on the defensive end. So
Yeah. So I mean, again, like I feel like for a lot of these, a lot of it's kind of just cut and dry, where it's just again, for some of them, it's the guys that because a lot, multiple, several of these guys are kind of familiar names at this point, with some new faces, which I think is really cool to see. So it's a really good mix. Again, some of it's due to injury because there's a couple of guys I think would be on this list if they were healthy, right? Like Wemby. But again, that's how the 65 game rule works. There's also some guys that are kind of like they're not full blown starters, right? Like there's several guys in OKC who could, if be on this list, but they don't play. I don't think they qualified to either play enough games or
yeah,
play enough minutes,
yeah,
right? So it's kind of a weird list. And I already mentioned some guys that even on the All NBA list that aren't going to be on there just because of the fact that they've missed too many games. I already listed all of that, but now we go to the rookies, I guess, to close it off. I'm gonna assume again this one's probably gonna be relatively similar. Maybe a couple of guys in and out, whatever. Um, for my first team, I had Alexander Sarr, whichever one you want to say. For the Washington Wizards, right? Again, the efficiency, the shooting splits don't look that amazing, but I think I'm willing to give him a pass because it is the Washington Wizards. There's not a lot of great complementary talent next to him, right? To under 40 from the field and 31 from three. So that's not really that great. But I think defensively, there's a lot there. I think there's a lot to like in terms of his shot blocking, his mobility, his timing. I think and then also you look at his even his passing playmaking, right? Over 2.5 assists a game. I think that's really good for a big, especially again on a team like Washington that doesn't really have like a lot of great options to play through. He seemed like kind of one of those guys where, I think there were of course a lot of people that liked him, right? Obviously we both had him as, one of the top picks in the draft. I think I had him at 1, you had him at 2. Um and then there were other people who were like, I don't know. This guy kind of looks like he might be a little bit of a bust. Obviously, looked really rough early on in the season, but the great news is that doesn't matter how you start the season. It matters more so how you close it out. And I think he's been way better as the season has gone on. And he's definitely hurt some teams in some ways. Like he definitely hurt Denver. Beat him twice.
mm-hmm,
So I mean,
mm-hmm,
and look at some of these other situations too. So I think he's kind of shown. I think he's going to be a good player. Probably not like the best guy on a team, maybe not even second best, but I think he seems to profile as I think a pretty important piece of a team that seems like it's got like a decent foundation under it as long as they can get, another franchise guy.
yeah.
Then yeah, if you want to unless
No,
you want to say some more words and then
no,
I'll
not at all.
yeah. Reese Shea also on the list as well, right? The number one pick, couldn't really leave him out of there. He's been great. I think before we got on, right, he had like a 30+ point game again against the Brooklyn Nets. But as a whole, he's another guy that's been better over the course of the year, right? Where, the shooting splits were kind of rough, right, to start off, but they've really kind of, they've been a lot better as of late on the season. 45 from the field, 35 from three. Just kind of looks like which an ideal, 3-and-D wing with, some other positive qualities as well. Seems pretty smart. Can make some solid plays, attack closeouts, things like that. So as long as he continues to grow, I think he's going to be a really good player for them. And then after that, Castle, obviously couldn't leave him out. Rookie of the year for both of us, right? So he's going to be on that first team as well. Already explained that. Jalen Walls for the Grizzlies. Unfortunately, he got hurt. Seems like a season-ending injury, a really horrible fall that occurred in a game against the Charlotte Hornets. But I think what he was able to do on both ends of the floor, again, another 3-and-D wing, right? And he was the guy that Memphis kind of used to guard a lot of the other teams' best opposing, perimeter guys. I mean, and I think he's definitely going to be missed by the Grizzlies not being able to play the remaining part of the season, especially when you see some of the teams that they're going to have to play to close out the season, potentially if they get to the playoffs or the play in, wherever, they go. I think that's a significant loss for them. And then to finish it off, Khalil Ware for the Heat, right? He's been kind of a revelation for them, right? Kind of what we talked about, right? Like a nice pairing to put next to Bam, right? As this, kind of athletic shot blocking big, right? So that way it doesn't just have to be Bam at the 5 all the time with other mediocre defenders, not a ton of size or athleticism around him. 3-point shot has been kind of up and down, but I think you can at least see a good starting point there. Again, counting stats, 9 points, 7 rebounds, but over a block a game, 20 minutes a game, and 22 minutes a game. So I think there's a lot to like there. From all these guys. Again, like, do I expect any of these guys to be superstars? Probably not, but they all at least seem like they're going to be very impactful players for good teams. And I think that's kind of what we were hoping for from a lot of these picks.
Yeah, I think that's a great list. I'm kind of on the fence about one of my guys just because the sample size is so small due to an injury.
Okay.
But I know that this award or honor doesn't have really like a participation count, I believe, or like a
No, it does not. No,
yeah.
it does not.
So I do kind of have to put Jared McCain first. I think you do have to shout out what he was doing. Very small sample size. He only played 23 games this season. But when he was healthy, he was kind of the runaway favorite. I think the early runaway favorite to be rookie of the year, and yeah, he just looked special night in, night out. The efficiency was all over the place in terms of good numbers, very good numbers, and yeah, the scoring totals were nuts as well, and he was doing it on Philly. So shout out to him. Stephon Castle I had as well, kind of same reasoning as you. Zachary Risachet, very underrated, I think, this year. He was kind of doing a lot of the little things that don't really get put into the stat sheet a lot. I think he was okay defensively, but his off-ball IQ, I think, is something that really, stood out to me. And playing with Trae Young and having an off-ball IQ like that, I think will take him a long way. And I think he'll be a lot better than some people thought initially. I think you do have to put Jalen Wells in there as well. What he was able to do, for pretty much all throughout the year on this Memphis team. Granted, they are kind of reeling and did fall in the standings, but at a certain point they were a top 2 team in the NBA or in the Western Conference. So I think you do have to give a nod to him. And then Alex Sarr, yeah, he's something, all right. I don't mean that in a bad way. He's kind of all over the
Right.
place in terms of offensively, where the efficiency is not there. The touch sometimes is not there, and I know it sounds like I'm dogging on him, but I'm really not, because I think he's shown, I think, the most potential and the most flashes out of everybody in this rookie class to be, something super special. The 3-point percentage, I think, is something that I've been thoroughly impressed with. I know it's around like 31% or something like that, but I thought it was going to be way lower based on what I saw in the summer league and tape from overseas. But defensively, I think, is where he really shines. I'd like to see him be a better rebounder at some point, but yeah, just his defensive impact and his ability to kind of switch from being a big man to a guard is kind of cool. Having watched a lot of Wizards basketball this year, so yeah, he gets my final first team nod.
Yeah, I agree. Then we go into second team all rookie. I don't know why defense and rookie only have 2, and
I know.
then the NBA one is 3. I don't really know what the point of that
Yeah,
is,
I
but
know.
either way, second team all rookie. I got Zach Edey of the Memphis Grizzlies. I know it's kind of rough that our pick for rookie of the year is only going to be able to muster up second team all NBA, but that's fine, right? I think he's shown. I think he has actually shown, like, pretty decent moments of being, I think, a good player. Obviously, again, there's been some other rough moments as well, right? But again, 9 and 8, over a block a game, 20 minutes a game, 58 from the field. Even showed some flashes of a 3-point shot, I guess. So I think, again, I think he can be a guy that over the course of time, is going to be like a decent center. Again, is he probably going to be as good as he was in college? No. But I think, again, I think he's still shown flashes of solid play. Klingon, That's the other guy that I have in here. I think if you've watched him for the Portland Trailblazers, I think he's been really good, especially on the defensive end. His rebounding, his shot blocking, pretty much kind of what the Blazers were hoping for, right, on the season. You look at his numbers, they don't really look amazing, but just again, only 20 minutes a game, and you got to factor in so much of Portland's season consisted for a while of them already having a couple other bigs that were playing ahead of him because those guys have been in the league for longer, right? Guys like DeAndre Ayton and Robert Williams. But, since those guys have both gone down due to injury, his playing time has gone up. He's starting and he's taking advantage where, now you can really see, why a lot of people liked him in the draft, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can just see, all the positive qualities about him that we talked about. Yves Misi, another big as well for the New Orleans Pelicans. This was a guy that I don't think we were really sure about in terms of what could he actually do for the Pelicans as a rookie. Answer was it's actually pretty good.
Yeah.
Again, 9 and 8. Not crazy numbers, but over a block a game shows that he's gonna be a pretty solid starting big. I think. Again, defensively, shot blocking, good rebounder, good lob threat, good athlete. Didn't seem quite as raw as I think we thought he might be coming into the league. Even showing some flashes where again over an assist a game. So think there's a lot to like there. We'll see where his game continues to grow. Obviously, for New Orleans, it's been a pretty rough season as a whole because they've just been decimated due to injuries. But I think he's probably been one of their biggest bright spots, right? And then to round out the list, Bob Carrington for the Wizards, right? I think he's been, a pretty good guard for them. Also, the youngest guy in the draft, right? I think this was a guy that both of us actually liked coming out of college. Again, another guy where you look at the stats, efficiency, they don't look amazing. But as a rookie, it's kind of hard for me to care as much about that kind of stuff, especially, again, given the team as a whole. Just, again, I like his rebounding as a guard, the additional playmaking, the ability to score off the dribble. Again, 3-point percentage could be better. But I think as a rookie, I think he showed some pretty good flashes, especially, again, for the Wizards. If you've watched a lot of their games during this latter part of the season, right, where it's like post-trade deadline, couple of veterans that have come in, right, couple of guys that have been sent out, more playing time and opportunity for their young guys. A lot of these young guys have looked a lot better as the season has gone on, and I think he's definitely been one of them. And then the other one to round out my list is Isaiah Collier. I actually had him, in there. And the Utah Jazz, pretty nightmarish season for them. I mean, of course, they expect it to be bad. I think they've probably been worse than I think some people thought. Now, some of it is by their own doing. They've sat guys. Guys have been in and out due to whatever. But I think he's definitely been a bright spot. Can't really shoot. 25% from three, so that's not really ideal. But I think his passing and playmaking has been really good. 6 assists a game on this team, I think is a pretty big accomplishment. In 71 games, 9 points, 42 from the field. So there's something there. I mean, again, of course, we'll see if it can continue to be better. If you look at his last 10 games, he's averaged like 14 and 7, right? Still not really shooting threes. But again, I think you like, the ability to, set guys up. And like I said, there's something there for him to grow as an offensive player. It's just, again, can he get that shot down? But it's funny, right? Because this was a guy who was ranked pretty highly, in the draft by most people's standards. And then he fell a significant amount. But, he's, been kind of showing for a decent chunk of the season, why I guess they liked him. Again, there's still some weaknesses there, but, we'll see what he can kind of do when the team becomes a little bit more serious because it wasn't this year.
Yeah, I agree. Mine's a similar list. I had I had Eves Missy. Kind of same reasoning as you. Zach Edey, same reasoning once again. I basically have 3 big men here: Kelly Ware, Isaiah Collier, and Bub Carrington. Just overall, I've been thoroughly impressed with the second team guys, and a lot of them didn't really have a whole lot of opportunity to begin with at the beginning of the year, but as the season went on, gradually they look really good, and I've really been dialed in on them for the month of March. That's kind of like the stretch where you do tend to see a lot of rookies that weren't getting a lot of opportunities, start to get those opportunities and the minutes start to go up and stuff like that. Cause like you're talking about, people start sitting guys because they know the season is completely over. So
Mhm.
yeah, shout out to people who have been taking advantage of that, really specifically like a guy like Bub Carrington, because my God, he doesn't miss mid ranges.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, as a whole, rookie class, little we kind of expected it to be a little bit underwhelming relative to some previous draft classes, but I think you can see there are some good players in there. Are there any honorable mentions you think we should hit on? Maybe I guess maybe a couple like Matas Bucelas, and maybe some others, but what do you think?
Yeah, Matas Bucelis, Kyle Filipowski as well. um,
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just thinking of a clip that was sent to me earlier, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think those two guys are pretty solid.
Yeah, I agree. And again, like you can factor in like a Dalton Connect and a couple other guys, but as a whole, I've been impressed by what I've seen from a number of these rookies. Again, we'll see what it looks like as their careers go on, but I think there's a good foundation for a lot of these players.
Yeah.
Now to close it off, more standings watch. And this is going to be the second to last time we do this.
Yep.
Again, in the Eastern Conference, Cleveland and Boston, they've clinched the 1 and 2 spot. So it really comes down, I guess, to 3 through 6, right? I think so the Pacers with their win, they've clinched basically no worse than 4. With the Knicks losing to Detroit, right? It's actually like very, very close, where I think like New York's probably going to have to win out in order to stay at 3, or else they'll drop to 4. We'll see, what happens. So the Knicks have 2 games left, and it looks like the Pacers have 2 games left as well, right? Knicks are 50 and 30, Pacers are 49 and 31. Looks like the Bucks probably will stay at 5. I think they just won their game against the Pelicans, right? So I don't know if NBA.com has updated it yet. Obviously, the Pistons just got to win over the Knicks, but I feel like 5 and 6 probably set, and then we'll see if the Knicks and Pacers, either switch spots or stay the same. The Pacers, I think they're final games of the regular season, right? If we look at their schedule, I think their last couple of games, it looks like it's going to be against Orlando and then Cleveland again. I mean, they could probably win both of those games. I mean, Cleveland doesn't have anything left to play for at this point. Their record is what it is. I think I think they've also clinched the 7 spot as well, if
Yes,
I'm
they
not
have.
mistaken.
Yes.
So they don't really, yeah, so they don't, I mean, their young guys will probably still play, but they don't really have much left to play for. And then the Knicks' last couple of games, if we look at their schedule, right, it looks like their last 2 games, I believe, are against the Cavs again. Again, maybe nothing to play for, and then the Nets.
Yeah, I mean, it's not nearly as hectic as the other side, but yeah, the Eastern
Right. Yeah.
Conference, it's kind of shaping up to be somewhat, I think, how we've been looking at it for like the past month or so. So,
Mm-hmm.
no real surprises there.
Yeah, exactly. And then we go into the Western Conference, and that's where it's just a complete just just craziness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a movie basically, right? So where it stands as of right now, again, it'll be updated on Sunday by the time we record again. um so OKC pretty much has wrapped up the 1 seed. We knew that. They did that a long time ago. They're way ahead of everybody.
Yep.
The Rockets, I believe, have clinched the 2 seed, right? They are, I think, 3 games ahead of the Lakers, right? And the Lakers only have 2 games left, so they've wrapped up the 2nd seed. But pretty much 3 through 8, I believe, is still in the balance, right? Because the Kings and the Mavs think they're pretty much set at 9 and 10. We'll see if they can really do anything with the, in their playing games. But 3 through 8 is where things are still in the balance. So the Lakers currently are 3. They have clinched a playoff spot, so they cannot fall into the play-in. They own the tiebreakers against pretty much everybody below them. But they do have 2 games left. They play the Rockets, and then they also play the Blazers. So they need to win at least one of those games in order to keep the 3 seed. And then after that, right, we did have, initially, right, it was like the Clippers were 4, the Nuggets were 5, Warriors were 6, and then Grizzlies were 7, and Minnesota was 8. But then we had a couple of big things that happened, right? So the Warriors, they lost their last game at to the Spurs right at the buzzer, right? Harrison Barnes hits a game-winning 3, contested game-winning 3. right, to win that game. And so they lost by 3, and now they've dropped actually to 7. So even though they've been, really good post Jimmy Butler trade, they're 6-4 in their last 10, because of this loss. And now they're in the play-in. Now the thing is, there's still a few games left in the balance. As we're recording, the Grizzlies and the Wolves are playing right now, right? So currently it's halftime. Looks like the Grizzlies are up. Of course, they could blow it. They have not been very good against winning teams. They also have a back-to-back as well. They will play the Wolves tonight, or they will play the Wolves on Thursday, and then by the time you're watching this Friday, they may have already played against the Denver Nuggets. So there's a chance for the Grizzlies to stay in 6, but nothing's clinched after the 2 seed. So do you have any predictions for how you think this might end? Right, given the map, what the map looks like right now.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I'm thinking that 1 through 3 will probably stay the same. So that's Oklahoma,
Okay.
obviously Oklahoma City. I think Houston
Mhm.
will stay. I think LA will stay as well.
They're mathematically locked in. Houston's mathematically the 2 seed.
Exactly. I probably would say Denver probably stays. I think the Clippers will stay just because of momentum.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I'm kind of curious about this whole Memphis one.
hmm Yeah, they're the
They,
ones that I think could possibly fall.
yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. I think they might fall by, yeah, I think they might fall maybe to what, the 7th.
Yeah, because I think they have the tiebreaker. I think over minute, although they're playing right now, so I'm not sure what they're. I think they beat the Wolves the last couple of times. I think I saw them play, but the Warriors have the tiebreaker over both the Grizzlies and the Wolves, so they can't get into a tie with either of those teams. They need to win out if they want to keep 6. And then Golden State, I think as long as they win out, maybe they'll get out of it, but they still need a little bit of help. They'll also have a big game, the last game of the regular season, because they have one game against the Blazers, probably a win, although we thought they would beat the Spurs, but that type of stuff does happen, right? We've seen all of these teams have bad losses at different points. That's kind of why they're all in the spot that they're in.
Yes.
Um, and then they have a final game against the Clippers on Sunday, right? Where the Clippers are 8-2 in their last 10. The Warriors are 6-4. And it's very likely that if they win, they'll probably be top 6. If they lose, then they're in the play-in, where that's kind of the spot that you don't really want to be at all. Not that they, you know, are a lot to lose in the play-in, because I guess the best case scenario is maybe you are in there and you play Houston in the first round, but you don't really want to be in there because you could just be 2 bad games away from being out of it, because they've been in that situation before, right? Because they were in the play-in, what was it, in 2021? Obviously, very different team, but they were the 8th seed. They lost to the Lakers in a pretty back and forth game, lost basically right at the end. Then they lost to the Grizzlies in overtime, and then their season was over. And then last year, we expected them to get into the playoffs, even though they were 10, right? So that was already kind of an uphill battle. They lost the first game to the Kings, and their season was over. So, that's the tough part of starting where they were initially at, because, any one bad loss, can kind of set you back. And again, they've been mostly great since the trade. It's not like they've been bad at all. It's just been like a couple of losses here or there that I guess are louder because, it puts them in a different spot. I think they will still probably finish as 6, which means if they do finish at 6, we could be headed towards a Lakers Warriors first round matchup.
Oh,
Obviously, we'll see what happens, of course, by the time the regular season ends, right? Because I think it'll be over way before we record, anyway. So
yeah.
we'll know at least what the pre-play-in standings will be, right? By Sunday.
Hmm.
But it's a race. It's a race, and I can't really act like I know what's going to happen, but I think the Lakers will probably win one of their last 2 games, right? The Rockets, they played the Clippers, they sat their guys. I'm going to assume they're going to play against LA, so that's probably not going to be an easy win. But if they win one, they're the 3 seed. Then after that, it just depends on what everyone else does. But again, only 1 and 2 are set. And
Yeah.
I actually, looking at the Rockets, it's not mathematically set, but I think it's just pretty much almost a guarantee that they're going to be
Yeah, it's
the
really
3 seed. I
close.
mean, I think they would have to lose every game the rest of the way. Because what are their last couple of games? I guess they play the Lakers, and then I think they play Denver,
Yeah.
right? But like with them being 3 games ahead, it's probably going to be tough for them to drop to 3. or drop to 3. I think they're probably going to stay at 2. But,
Exactly.
just yeah, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they'll stay. Like I said,
Mhm.
I think they're a lock for number 2. Like you said, mathematically not 100%, but I don't really see a scenario where they lose out completely.
Right. And again, like I said, all these teams, because we hadn't even mentioned Minnesota, right? Where they had, prior to that Memphis game, right? They had a bad loss where what were they up like 20 in the fourth quarter? And then, with like 10 minutes to go, and then they found a way to lose that game
Yep.
somehow, right? To the Milwaukee Bucks. But just as a whole, I don't know. I mean, like I said, I can't really pretend to know what's gonna happen. I know that sounds kind of like a cop out, but
I
I
agree
mean,
with you though.
at least any. I mean, we know that at least the Lakers won't be in the play-in,
Yeah.
but there's no guarantee that they stay 3. Right? They're gonna have to win at least one of these last couple of games, and then of course, for some of these teams, they will play one another. Like, of course, the Wolves and the Grizzlies are playing right now. I believe the Grizzlies and the Nuggets will also play. And as I already mentioned, the Clippers and the Warriors will play one another. So we don't really know for sure. Is there like an ideal roadmap that you would like to see? Like, is there an ideal set of first round matchups that'd be pretty appealing to you? Or are you kind of just like, let's just see where this goes, pretty comfortable with whatever?
I'm really comfortable with whatever because I think there's that much talent in the Western Conference.
Mhm.
I'm really okay with any matchup because I think all of them are probably gonna be some pretty lengthy series. I think
Okay.
especially for the first round because there's so much
Mhm.
talent. Through 1 through 8. I'm not really concerned with the play-in. Um, granted, but the Kings or Dallas could give somebody a scare. I mean, but
Just
regardless,
the scenario of a hot shooting game could
exactly.
end your season. You never want to be in that
Exactly.
scenario.
It's very
You know what
volatile.
I mean?
Yes, it's very
Yeah, like that's
volatile.
the problem. Like, it's not that you're expecting the Mavs to win or the Kings to win. It's just like say it's, the Wolves or Golden State. And let's say it's just like you're playing the Mavs in that 8-9 matchup, and let's say AD just has a big game where he's the best player on the floor. Not saying it's gonna happen.
Right.
But let's just say he plays great. Maybe somebody on the Mavs gets hot. PJ Washington knocks down a bunch of threes like he did against Oklahoma City or something like that.
Yep.
Or say with the Kings, Levine, DeRozan score like a combined 80 points, and then your season's over. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but none of these teams want to be in the play. They all want to win, but not all of them can win because they will play one another. But let's say we froze the standings right now, and let's say that like these were the 1 through 8. What do you think of these matchups? So you get OKC, Minnesota, Houston, Golden State, Lakers, Grizzlies, and then Nuggets, Clippers.
I like all of these to be honest because I think there's room for an upset, in each and every one of them. Maybe outside of the OKC Minnesota one, but
Mhm.
yeah, I'd be thoroughly happy with a lot of these because we saw a lot of these teams kind of verse each other, in this last month or so. So we do have somewhat of a preview of what a 7 game series would look like. So I'm pretty
Yeah.
hyped about it.
Yeah. Then one last, I guess, thing before we get out of here. The Phoenix Suns, the other night, they did lose to the Oklahoma City Thunder, so now they have been mathematically eliminated from the postseason. Just kind of tough, right? Because this was a team where we can't run from it. I know we neither of us thought that they were going to win the title, but worst case scenario, we thought they would be a high level seed, right? We both picked the over on them, which I think was like 50 games. Um, we at least worst case scenario thought they would look like a contender, even if we didn't really take them as seriously as a championship level team, but we thought they'd be a contender, and it just has not been the case outside of what, like the first 10, 15 games or whatever.
Yeah.
So what the heck happened? I know you've watched way more Suns basketball than I have. I've kind of tuned them out since they've just kind of fallen off the map. But, I mean, I guess I've seen a couple games here and there, but not really. So since you've watched a lot of Suns basketball this season, what do you think kind of happened with this team? I mean, of course, you can take it any direction you want. Why do you think this just went as pretty much worst case scenario as poorly as it could have gone? Because I mean, now they're 10 games under 500. I know Durant's been hurt the last several games, and I know they've been statistically good when he plays,
Yeah.
but you just think they would at least be better even if he's not out there.
Yeah, just not enough ball to go around. Number one, the chemistry seemed way off. The personnel, you never really had it in the first place. interesting start to the season where it was like, okay, we could see a lot of the potential. KD's kind of firing on all cylinders. Book is playing number 2 for some reason, but regardless, it didn't matter. They were kind of, just kind of riding the hot hand, and then KD went down, and all of a sudden things really, really started getting rough for them. And then Beal kind of had to be elevated into a, I guess, higher role. And he wasn't playing bad at first, but I think then, when KD came back, that's when you really started to feel the impact or lack of impact that I think Beal brings to the team. And it's not that he's a bad player or anything like that, because we know how dominant he was in Washington when he was pretty much the sole option. But I think, when he's a ball dominant player like that and he's kind of relegated to the third option and then coming off the bench as well, just it was never really going to work. And that's what the thing that sucks about this whole thing is, because I think KD and Book is a great duo and a great pairing, especially when they are healthy. But the problem is, Beal's contract, he's probably the one that you would want to move, but since he has the no trade clause, it's almost dang near impossible to move him. So you
Yeah.
kind of have to pivot to the next best thing, unfortunately, which is KD. And I think, that's going to really sting when they do probably eventually have to move on from him in the offseason. But my God, what a disaster. They never really had a big man to really go to that could, anchor everything down low on the defensive end and even really help them out on the offensive end. Like Nurkic wasn't really a physical screen setting big. And the utilization of him was odd as well, because they tried to make him a stretch 5 for some reason when, he's more, I guess, of a low post kind of guy. I don't know, but I don't even know if you could really classify him as that at this point, but kind of more of an inside threat, but overall just nasty. They tried, bringing in a table setter in Tyus Jones, but even then that didn't look pretty either, so cuz it just they had so many holes on the defensive end when you did have, all 4 of those guys out there, and it just didn't look good pretty much from the moment KD went down.
Yeah. And you do kind of wonder, like, where do they go, from here? Because there's been, kind of conflicting reports at different points, right? Like some have, there've been many reports about teams that would be interested in getting him. There's been reports about maybe they might want to keep him. Now there are guys who cover the Suns. I think one guy, John Gambador, has mentioned the idea that, like, if they can't trade Beal, they may waive and stretch him, right? Which would be, pretty tough pill to swallow. We'll see if it comes to that. But yeah, I guess, if let's say, you took over the Suns, for a little bit, like, would you like, is there anyone you'd consider keeping on that roster? Like, would you still try to just kind of have a do-over, move Durant, see whatever you can do with Beal, and then just build around Booker? Or are you kind of ready to just blow it all up and just kind of get back whatever you can?
I mean, I'd love to see a year where it's Devin Booker and KD surrounded with tons of talent, and 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 maybe more so talent is maybe the wrong word, but really, talented role players, that have a specific niche on the defensive end, a true table setter, a physical screen setting big, instead of tripling down on pretty much the same thing, a ball dominant scorer that can a ball dominant 3-level scorer. Like I just don't think the Beal piece is something that you can move forward with. And I'm very curious what the heck goes down this offseason, because I think you probably don't want to move Booker, because I think he probably has the most potential of the 3. KD is peaked. He's on the older end of things. Beal is not as good as Booker. So I think you do really have to take that into consideration, where it's like you probably are going to have to be forced into doing some sort of janky rebuild with Devin Booker, which might end up wasting his entire career.
Right, because they were kind of doing that before, and or they were building up to something,
Mm-hmm.
right? When they first got him, and then that culminated into a finals run. They didn't end up winning, but then the next year they were really good. Then they lost to the Mavs, and then it just feels like everything just kind of fell apart from there. The Durant trade, perfectly fine, right? I mean, again, one of the best players in the league at that point, so that makes a lot of sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? But after that, then that's where it kind of went off the rails, right? Moving Aiton and the return you got back for him, not really ideal, right? Moving Chris Paul for Bradley Beal, I mean, feels like an upgrade personnel wise, but fit wise, not really. And now you have the worst contract in the league, right? And it's rough because we liked what they did this summer, but it seems like they've taken a step back, right? I mean, even before the Durant injury, they were already kind of headed towards probably not making the playoffs, right? That kind of just cemented it. So, even with the rookies and, again, Budenholzer, maybe you can say he hasn't done a great job, but I mean, they got rid of Vogel last year, right? And he actually got them to a better record. And that was, within a tougher situation where they didn't have very many games where all three of them played together. Although Beal's not been as available as of late anyways, but, it's kind of whatever at this point.
Yeah, and just to clarify, when I say KD went down, I'm talking about very early in the season.
Right.
When I guess people had him in the MVP conversation, but
Right.
yeah, just to clarify.
So all right, so now to close it, before we close it out, our last post on Instagram, we put up a poll: will the Warriors make the finals? This was our last, one of our last shorts that we put out. And the pretty obvious question, and we actually had 73% of the responses say yes. So it seems like most of the people who responded believe that that's the team that's going to make the finals in the Western Conference. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's some serious noise behind it. It makes sense, totally, because the last time we saw Steph with some genuine help, as being a legit number 2 option, it was a dynasty, and we even saw him do it, with the, I believe, the 22 team or whatever, and that was phenomenal. You had Andrew Wiggins playing up in terms of talent, Jordan Poole coming off the bench. So I think there are kind of some similarities in terms of the personnel, especially with bringing a guy like Jimmy Butler. There's so much potential there, and I think they're truly the one team, I think, that's not a top 3 team to really watch, because there's so much untapped potential there of Jimmy Butler and Steph both popping off and potentially going to the
Yeah,
NBA Finals. It could be a thing.
I think they can definitely do it. I think they got to solidify being out of that play-in. I just don't like the idea of being in the play-in, and trying to make the finals in the Western Conference.
Agreed.
Like in the past, you could get away with it in the East. You can't even really do that anymore, right? Because the top 2 seeds in the East are, at this point, pretty much tough outs anyways, right?
Yeah.
So maybe even tougher than some of the West teams.
Yeah.
We'll see. But yeah, I think that. I mean, again, they're not going to be the favorite. But pretty much again, outside of OKC, there's not really another team where you're like, oh yeah, this is an obvious. This team is obviously going to make the finals, right? OKC's probably the only one, and with the way that we saw them against the last couple of teams they played, it may not be quite as cut and dry as OKC makes it. Like, I think our pick is still OKC making the finals and representing the West, right? But you got to be at least a little bit more concerned, with how they played against some of these teams, right?
Yes.
But we'll see.
Yeah.
Um, well, that pretty much concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on the Michael Malone firing, and whether or not you think it's going to help Denver, whether or not you think it makes sense. Let us know your thoughts on Luka's return to Dallas, right? And what you thought of that game and the environment and the situation in terms of everything going on there, because obviously it's been just a nightmare scenario for the Mavs, and the complete opposite for LA. And then let us know your thoughts on, our picks for All NBA, regular season awards, everything like that, and whether or not you agree or disagree. And then obviously, how about the standings, right? In terms of what you think of the standings and which teams you want to see in which spots. What do you think is going to happen at the end of the season? And again, if you leave, a comment in at the end of one of our videos, we'll try to read it at the end of the video, right? And then also join our Instagram, join our socials, right? Obviously, we put that poll out on Instagram. You can always answer, and we'll check out the responses and see what people think. And also continue to like and subscribe to our content, and to help our channel grow. We appreciate it all. We'll see you next episode. Regular season's almost done.